Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
There are many ways we talk about caste in modern India, sometimes through personalities like the debate between Mahatma Gandhi and B.R. Ambedkar, sometimes through the prism of reportage on caste violence and massacres, sometimes through politics, looking at the power of the Dalit vote or the fortunes of a party like BSP. But rarely do we look at the intersection of caste and law. Yet it's the law that has been used again and again as the main weapon in the fight for social equality. In 1950, the Constitution stipulated a national law defining and penalizing various offences related to the practice of untouchability. In 1989, India enacted a stringent law focused on caste atrocities or violent crimes against Dalits. But these laws all stand on the shoulders of other measures and laws or the attempts to pass other measures. And in those fights, there are many names who don't even get a passing mention in our history books. Manoj Mitta has uncovered many of these stories in his new book, Caste Pride, Battles for Equality in Hindu India, and he joins us on the show. Manoj Mitta, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
The book's subtitle is Battle for Equality in Hindu India. And I was curious why you chose the words Hindu India, since now we acknowledge even Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, they also practice caste.
See, the book I set out to write was far different from the one you're holding in your hands. That was meant to be focused on violence, because the two earlier books of mine were also on mass violence. They were on communal violence, the two most egregious instances of communal violence in independent India, 1984 and 2002. And what I set out to write was a book on mass violence targeting Dalits. Why there is so much impunity for it, despite what is considered a draconian law, the 1989 Prevention of Atrocities Act, right? And then when I was surveying those cases, I again and again ran into this pattern of some arm or the other of the Indian state, be it the police, prosecution, trial court or appellate court, betraying what appeared to me cavalier attitude or worse caste bias, deeply entrenched, conscious or subconscious, resulting in acquittals or impunity for the flimsiest of reasons. So I wanted to understand where this was coming from, because it was such a pervasive pattern, right? So that led me to these debates related to the abolition of untouchability. And then that deep dive led me to earlier debates going all the way back to early 19th century. So it's over a span of 2 centuries of legislative and judicial debates. So what I'm in effect talking about is previously unseen legislative and judicial records. I mean, it was indeed a treasure trove of new material. Given the fact that this issue of caste is originally from Hindu culture, religion, civilization, whatever word you choose to use or you're comfortable to use, you may, right? So the debates that took place over these 2 centuries were primarily about Hindus. So it is not something that I chose. I do recognize, as you said, that there are, say, Pasmandas who are majority of Muslims. And since they are supposed to have converted from Hinduism, yes, in this ecosystem, you don't overnight shed that stigma. And there have been a few instances, but what I focused on in this current volume were essentially about the reforms that were being attempted through legislature or courts in regard to what was happening among Hindus, and hence the title. And some of these issues which are not figuring in this book, I may add, will be figuring most probably in my next volume. What I meant by most probably was that no book is going to be encyclopedic or absolutely exhaustive. I am choosing such material which is new, where I am adding something to the existing literature. So that being so, there might be some instances which you are familiar with, which you think is important, but not necessarily figuring in the book. That's the explanation for that.
This book, I should tell listeners, is over 600 pages. Even though you say it's not encyclopedic, no book can be encyclopedic. It comes close. But what is the earliest record you found, Manoj, when caste becomes a legal issue in British India?
See, the earliest reference I give is to something that was done towards the end of the 18th century when the Bengal presidency chose to exempt Banaras Brahmins from the death penalty. This was in keeping with the traditional notion that under no circumstances should Brahmins, the elite section of Hindus, be killed, because that would amount to Brahmahatya, for which there is no redemption. It's another matter that 2 or 3 decades later they did away with it. Where I came up with absolutely new material, and the earliest among such new material is something that goes back to 1816. It's Madras regulation, where there was singling out of members of lower caste for a particularly barbaric and corporal punishment which was imported from the West. It's called confinement in stocks. It's something that involves confining the feet of the convicted person in a plank of wood. A couple of holes are put, and you are put in a public place and you are exposed to ridicule. And that's how this expression laughing stock came into being. So that was something that was introduced in Madras by somebody who went on to become a very popular governor, Thomas Munro, and it was in force for a century. It was only in the early 20th century, the second decade of the 20th century, it was finally repealed.
And that was imposed for what crime would somebody be confined in stocks?
Yeah, a good question. It was something that was delegated, that authority was delegated to village heads. It was part of their broader strategy of co-opting the elite among Indians, primarily Hindus, into their administration, because they figured that is how they would be able to rule a country of this magnitude and complexity and diversity. It was used extensively without any dimmer, because it was fitting into prejudice that was ingrained in us. So it was a marriage between a Western form of corporal punishment, barbaric as it is, and a very old prejudice that was there among us. To answer your question, since it was given to these village heads, it was not necessarily of a very serious nature. It was not for, say, murder or something of that. These were for smaller offences, which were the authority to adjudicate on such offences and award punishment was given to these village heads. And that led to a very interesting case law. Some of these were challenged before the High Court of Madras, and that led to that's what I discuss in the very first chapter of my book, where courts give judgments. Remember, this form of punishment was introduced at a time when Brits were yet to enumerate caste, and they were yet to get a clear idea of, there being 4 varnas, and then there are these avarnas below that, untouchables. So what they did was they had these rough and ready methods of figuring whether this form of punishment was being applied to people for who it was meant. So they would do a check on whether their social background was such that this form of punishment would not be demeaning to them. So if they found that, they have this kind of a social standing or economic standing which would not be appropriate for that member, they would say this was wrongly applied in this case. But where it was held that no, for him this is all right. You could expose him to such ridicule in a public square.
So when people objected to this, when people pushed back against it, was it done on the grounds that this is inhuman and discriminatory? Or was it more people saying, no, you shouldn't be doing it to me because I am actually of a higher caste and I shouldn't be put into stocks?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying, that when you look at the case law, these precedents, the judgments that were passed under that law, such were the instances where somebody would say, look, I'm not somebody who should have been subjected to this punishment because I don't fit this notion of lower caste, because I come from such and such background. So there was one ruling to the effect that, look, Muslims were part of the ruling elite of this country. So it could hardly be considered appropriate for a Muslim. So this is indeed meant for only such Hindus who are looked down upon, despised by their own co-religionists. This is something that very organically came about. Okay, we have to rule this country. We co-opt the elite, we appease them, and we structure our administration in such a way that it fits into their prejudices, their understanding of their society. So this is how it carried on for about a century, till by the second decade of 20th century, there were many changes. By then, the spread of education, especially English education, exposure to Western values, Enlightenment values, that spread a great deal. And then the representation of Indians in administration, in legislatures, in judiciary. And it was some Indian legislators, most notably a legislator called Narasimha Iyer, who sort of pinned down the government. Before that, it was one Kesava Pillai, and then Narasimha Iyer succeeded in pushing the British government into repealing that.
And in fact, you say even Dr. Ambedkar wasn't aware that it had been repealed.
When Ambedkar talked about it in 1954, this was in the context of the debate that took place in Parliament, in Rajya Sabha, which is what he was a member of, on a bill that was introduced to give teeth to the abolition of untouchability, which later became known as Untouchability Offences Act. So in that context, he was citing some very egregious examples of laws which had caste embedded in them, and he didn't know about the repeal of that. Now, what does that show? It shows that while there was a great deal of attention given to this political struggle, the parallel social struggle, whether it was through social movements or whether it was through legislation or judicial verdicts, now that did not get enough attention. Though, as scholars say, this parallel struggle relating to problems concerning our own social structure. This is not about the colonial rule. This, in fact, predated the colonial rule. You can go back to, say, even these Bhakti movement and all that. They were all critiquing this iniquitous, oppressive system and in various ways trying to reform it and so on and so forth. Now, that took a more formal form, the form that we relate to, in the form of, say, codification of laws, in the form of adjudicating them through modern institutions such as courts of law, what we understand them, and the way they were being talked about in schools and colleges and universities. So all that is something that ensued through the colonial period. Even so, those equality battles and the people who were engaged in those battles, I call them unsung heroes precisely because they did not get the attention that was due to them. Freedom fighters got probably more attention in comparison to these equality champions. So my focus was on these equality battles.
And in fact, you point out that many of these freedom fighters themselves often took quite defensive when it came to caste. But I want to go back to something a little earlier. When the crown takes over, one of the things Queen Victoria says is that they don't want to interfere in the local customs and traditions of the subjects because they've learned the lesson from what caused the uprising. Can you talk about how people use her words in a way to say you can't do anything about caste? Caste is our tradition.
Yeah, it was a complete perversion of Victoria's proclamation. And this was most evident in the drama that took place in Travancore, which was a vassal state of the British rule. It was directly attached to the Madras presidency. Now, so there was this very funny situation where you had the ruler of the Raja of Travancore, the Diwan of Travancore, one Madhav Rao, who otherwise acquired a great deal of reputation for being somebody who showed to the world that Indians, more specifically Hindus, were capable of administering the country, because he went on to be a very successful Diwan in Travancore, Indore and Baroda. So he is one of those valorized figures of the 19th century. Now, when he was in Travancore and holding that critical position, he was very much in bed with the Raja and the British resident. All three of them were united in perpetuating very regressive custom, which, members of a dominant caste, the Nair community, said, they interpreted that Victorian proclamation to mean that their old custom of disallowing members of the lower caste, most notably Shanars or Nadars, the women of that community, from covering their breasts, specifically using what is called breast cloth or upper cloth. So they said, look, you too wear this. This is creating a problem for us. And now that Victoria has assured us that there will be no interference with our customs, so we want to go back to a situation where you are not allowed to cover yourself, especially with upper cloth. It resulted in a proclamation in Travancore saying that henceforth women of Shanar community will not be allowed to cover their breasts. So that resulted in a backlash from the Madras governor, and he forced the three of them here to go back on that. It took another year or so for that reform to take place. And this kind of, what compelled the administration there, and what compelled somebody like Madhav Rao, who is supposed to be very progressive, to give in to this kind of prejudice was the fact that, in the South, what we saw, what was evident from a long time, was not just untouchability as is understood in the rest of the country, whether it's in the North or in the East. What was prevalent in the South was something worse, was at a different level. It was not just untouchability, but it was also unapproachability, or in some cases even unseeability. And that is the reason why when somebody like Swami Vivekananda, later in the same century, went on this All India tour, and when he reached the Malayalam-speaking areas, he was so horrified, he was so taken aback by the scale, by the nature of untouchability that was practiced there, that he called that whole area, that whole place a lunatic asylum. So I'm emphasizing on it for another reason. That is, we tend to see the colonial rule as a monolith. Okay, they were there to exploit us. Of course, any colonial structure is inherently exploitative, and it's not necessarily a force for good. But then there were aspects of the colonial rule which did a great deal of good, especially to people who were marginalized, which was the reason why people like Ambedkar were negotiating with the colonial rulers and saying, look, you shall not leave this country till you make sure that there are enough safeguards in place, because we don't want the white master to be replaced by a brown master. This is contrary to, say, what somebody like Shashi Tharoor, who is from indeed the same state, the same area, the way he portrayed them was all in black and white terms. We were so well off economically before you came, and by the time you left, we were so impoverished. That may well be true, but that's not the whole picture. There were other aspects too, which was the reason why not everybody went with Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. Not everybody boycotted legislatures and courts. They found value in participating in those processes to bring about certain reforms. And they succeeded in some cases to bring about those reforms. And in some other cases, they were thwarted by who? By, again, sections of our own community. Because by then, by the 20th century, the British was very clear that as a result of 1857, we are not going to be proactive. We are not going to be doing what Bentinck did in 1829 in the context of sati. We are not going to take such chances because we don't want to be accused again of interfering with your religious sentiments. So it's only wherever there was enough consensus, there was evidence of their society being ripe for a certain reform, did they then say, okay, you have established your case, you have established not only the desirability of the reform, but also the fact that there was enough support for it. So then and only then will we back that. So that's how, say, something like, Special Marriage Act, which was originally meant only for Brahmos, which effectively meant that whoever wanted to take advantage of the civil marriage provision, for whatever reason, it could be because it was a marriage across castes or across communities. So if they ever wanted to take advantage of that, they would have had to give a declaration, which was part of the statutory process, saying that they are not members of any of the recognized forms of religions. They were not Hindus or Muslims or Christians. But in 1923, there was one legislator. I'm citing that example because this was one of those early instances of reform, a major reform being done by one Hari Singh Gaur, who was one of those leading social reformers who participated in these legislative debates. And he was responsible in extending the Special Marriage Act to the Hindu community, which meant that you did not anymore have to give an undertaking that you are not a Hindu anymore. So that was a reform. That it came with some compromises is a different story. I won't go into that. But, there were all these parallel struggles that were going on in the context of social reform, which somehow fell through the cracks. That is the reason why I'm guilty of writing this book that is so voluminous. As I said, I wasn't even intending to go into these areas. It is to make sense of where this impunity for caste atrocities is coming from. Did I go into these areas? And then when I found that these very stirring and very revealing legislative and judicial debates never quite got the attention they deserve in any of our history books and so on, then I felt, okay, it is now something I cannot ignore. I have to take it upon myself. And it involved a bit of a struggle on my part because I'm essentially a journalist. So I was conscious of the fact that I was foraying into, the domain of historians and academics. But I felt that just the fact that nobody did it, required me to do it. And I went ahead and did it. And I did it as a reporter, as a journalist. I'm telling you stories here. I'm not doing it as a pundit. I do this whole book as a kathavachak, as a storyteller.
One of the things you say, in fact, Manoj, is that in 1850, that was the only legislation during British period that bore directly on caste autonomy. Until everything else, they were like, okay, we don't want to deal with this. This is you guys' problem. What was that 1850 law?
No, 1850 predated 1857. So this whole attitude of we don't want to deal with it unless you guys have a consensus on it came post 1857. So this is one of those pre-1857 enactments, much like, say, Sati. But in the case of this 1850 law, again, at the time of its enactment during rule of Lord Dalhousie, it was not very clear why it should have been called Caste Disabilities Removal Law, as it was named decades later, when the practice of giving short titles to laws came about. There were two distinct aspects to this 1850 law. One was about, those who converted not being penalized in terms of being denied family inheritance, right? And then the other aspect was that those who were deprived of caste, meaning those who were excommunicated from their caste by the caste panchayat. Such people need not have converted out of Hinduism or taken to another religion, not even Christianity. They could still be within the Hindu fold, but then it's debatable. Can you be a Hindu if you are not a member of any caste, if you are expelled? These were all grey areas, which were, far from resolved at the time. So there were these two distinct aspects to that law, that both of them were protected, that such people will not be denied that inheritance right?
When you mentioned Sati, I can't help but point out to listeners that one of the many surprising things you learn in the book is that in a case of Sati being committed, the lawyer for the defendants, the ones who were accused of abetting Sati, was none other than Motilal Nehru. And he used a very interesting argument.
Yeah, and this was in the Allahabad High Court. That was where he was known to practice extensively. And this was at a time when he was already in the public life. He had been elected to the provincial legislature and he was involved in Congress. And shortly after that went on to become president of Congress party. So in this case, what happened was he defended the accused, or rather convicted, because they were already convicted by the trial court. And at the appellate stage, he appeared for them, for people who took the plea that they were not guilty because they did not actually light the flame. They were not responsible for the fire being lit. It is something that happened spontaneously. There was spontaneous combustion because of the piety of the sati, of that woman. So we had nothing to do with it. Now, this plea was rejected outright by the trial court. And those people were defended for more or less the same reasons by Motilal Nehru, and he too met the same fate. His plea was rejected and it became a landmark case because there were copycat cases in other provinces. So this was being cited that, as was already held in this case, such excuses, such specious arguments will not be entertained. So it was interesting that somebody who went on to not only be Congress leader, but who went on to head the committee called Motilal Nehru Committee, which came up with the first draft of fundamental rights in 20s. So such are the ironies of history. I may at this point tell you that one of the driving factors of this book was that there was little work done by way of this intersection of caste and law. What corresponds to this in the West, in the US, is the intersection of law and race. That was so central to the history of that country. And therefore, you have so much research done on that subject in the US that it is part of their school textbooks too. So what I'm trying to say is that if I had attempted a book on, say, the intersection of law and race, I would have struggled to find anything substantially new to say. But in contrast, when it came to the intersection of law and caste, there was so much. And it's entirely by default. There's so much new material. That wherever I looked in archives, sometimes in the context of legislatures or sometimes in the context of courts, so much new material that is not explored or that was not studied enough.
And did you find that in these legislative battles, people were in fact looking to places like America taking inspiration from how they were dealing with race, trying to create the parallels of separate but equal here? Or I don't know if it was the other way around, where America was looking at our caste system to create separate but equal.
I don't know if our battles were being followed in US, but there's evidence in the form of, say, Mahatma Phule's famous book called Gulamgiri, Slavery, being dedicated to Americans for the reform they brought about in terms of abolishing slavery. So this is something that he cites as a source of inspiration in his own campaigns. And he was one of those early anti-caste leaders. And there's a chapter I have in the book on this reform relating to allowing marriages to take place without their being sanctified by a Brahmin priest. So he formed a society called Satyashodak, Truth Seekers Society. And one of the key activities of that was to introduce this form of marriage called Satyashodak form of marriage. Mind you, this happened in the 19th century, which did away with the role of a Brahmin priest. So it's one of those heartening features that a few months before he died, Phule had the satisfaction of seeing this form of marriage being upheld by the Bombay High Court.
Was this the case where if you don't use the Brahmin priest, you still have to pay him for the fact that, you should have been using him?
Yeah.
Because he's lost his commissions.
So that's a custom that was peculiar to the Maharashtrian area, Marathi-speaking areas. Even when it comes to how caste is practiced, there's so much diversity. So this was a custom prevalent in Maharashtra area. When a similar attempt was being made in Madras Presidency, that was in the 20th century. And in fact, it was partly post-independence. So the reform that they brought about there was called self-respect form of marriage, or Suya Maryada form of marriage. Again, it involved battles in the court, but unlike the Bombay High Court of the 19th century, the Madras High Court of independent India, it's a judgment that came about in early 50s when Rajaji was the chief minister of Madras. The Madras High Court gave a ruling that this form of marriage cannot be recognized. It's invalid because it does not conform to the traditional form of marriage. And not only are the marriages invalid, but the offspring of those marriages are illegitimate. So that led to a great deal of outrage and pushback from Periyar and his fellow reformers. I mean, one of his acolytes, that is Annadurai, he went on to form a political party, which was DMK. And then when that party came to power in 1967, one of the very first reforms they brought about was to amend the Hindu Marriage Act. I mean, bring about a local amendment, which is even as we speak applicable to the state of Tamil Nadu, where such a form of marriage where the role of the Brahmin priest is dispensed with, and they bring about reforms where even other allied features of a Hindu marriage like, say, Mangal Sutra or what they call Tali, or this whole notion of Kanyadan is no more necessary. It could be recognized form of marriage under the Hindu law. Well, that's what the Tamil Nadu amendment says, that even if it is something that involved merely exchange of garlands or exchange of rings, something which is bilateral in nature, something which recognized that both parties are equal. I mean, all it took was two consenting adults for that. They went into how there were different forms of marriage that were recognized, 8 forms of marriage that were recognized by our rituals. So this was something that was justified as a form of marriage that is one of those 8 forms. Gandharva. Yeah, sorry, I was not getting that name. That Gandharva form of marriage. The only thing is it hasn't caught on as much as the reformers hoped it would. That form of marriage still exists, but not as widely prevalent as it should have perhaps been.
No, but talk about intercaste marriages, Manoj. One of the fascinating portions of the book is how complicated this whole thing becomes. So you have these cases where a Rajput man has a mistress who is Shudra, lower caste, but he's accepted the children and everything. But then when it comes to inheritance, the children basically have to choose between either demoting the father to Shudra or letting him be upper caste and then foregoing the right to inheritance. This was the sort of conundrum.
Comical sides to this whole caste battles. Now, this has to do with one very fascinating trend that was there from the medieval period, which is that, contrary to scriptures, Brahmins took the view that, in Kali Yuga, we did not anymore have Chaturvarna, that it was no more 4 Varnas. In Kali Yuga, there were only 2 Varnas, was the view that they took. A very self-serving view. It was to say that there were only Brahmins and the rest of the Hindus were all Shudras. So it only widened the distance between Brahmins and the rest of Hindus, and it made it easier for them to show their superiority or their purity, and the rest had to grovel before them for whatever privileges they wanted. And that applied even to a medieval hero like Shivaji. Even he had to resort to all sorts of stratagems to finally get recognized as to confer the title of Chhatrapati upon himself, because they were of the view that being a Shudra, he was not entitled to that title. That was something that was reserved for Kshatriyas. But Kshatriyas did not exist anymore. Why did they not exist anymore? Because according to the Pauranic legend of Parshurama, all the Kshatriyas were exterminated in an earlier Yuga. So there were no Kshatriyas left in Kali Yuga. So how can this man, who is a Maratha of the Shudra caste, he was of a community called Bhonsles, so how could he be presumptuous enough to say that he should be conferred the title of Chhatrapati? They said, you are only a ruler in fact. I mean, a de facto ruler, but not a de jure ruler. I mean, you're not a ruler by right. Now, this matter came up again in the 19th century, and it went all the way. I mean, the example you are citing is from Bihar, a Rajput family. And that matter went all the way to the Privy Council in London, where effectively what these Rajputs were reduced to saying before those white masters was, please tell us, do we as Kshatriyas still exist or not? So it was left to somebody like Ranade, who was himself a Brahmin and who was a social reformer and who happened to be not only a political leader, but also a member of the judiciary. So as a member of the Bombay High Court, in the context of a case relating to Vaishyas, he said Vaishyas still exist. It's one of those ironies. The colonial rule restored Chaturvarna, because otherwise, for some time, it was made out that there were only 2 Varnas, Brahmins and Shudras.
And so when Indians come into this administrative structure in 1861, what was the first instance that you found where Indians actually legislatively got into this caste equality battle, and what prompted that?
Yeah. Great question. In 1916, it was left to somebody like an unknown Parsi legislator from central province which is now part of Maharashtra, to take up this reform. It was Manekji Dadabhoy. When he proposed resolution in what was known as the Imperial Legislative Council, a precursor to today's Lok Sabha, there was a heavy pushback he faced. Pushback from the Hindu right. What was the Hindu right? When I say Hindu right, it doesn't mean at all the Sangh Parivar that you know today, because RSS itself came into existence only in 1925. And a Hindu Mahasabha did exist in certain provinces, but it was still at a very nascent stage. And those members overlapped with Congress. So the Hindu right at that time was essentially in Congress. So the 2 most important leaders who vehemently objected to resolution about untouchability moved by Dadabhoy were Madan Mohan Malviya and Surendranath Banerjee. And they took the position that this was something that amounted to interference with their religion, and it was hurting their feelings, and how such things cannot be allowed to be taken up in this secular legislation, and so on and so forth. But this man made a strong case for it, saying, look, I waited all these years. Since nobody from the Hindu community thought it fit to talk about this section of our population, I felt that I should do it myself. And he pointed out the need. This was a seminal debate, very far-reaching debate, because that is when a whole lot of reforms, a whole lot of special administrative measures relating to this section of population, which is so peculiar to our society, our country. A section that was shunned by fellow Hindus, a section that was considered so impure that they had to live outside those villages. Their contact was contaminating. Their very sight was contaminating. So now their vulnerabilities, the iniquities they faced, they needed to be addressed in a very special way, because they were different from the rest of the population. So you needed to collect data concerning them. So this was all discussed for the first time at the level of the highest legislature. And as it happened, because Hindu members, influential as they were objecting to it, the colonial administration took it as a signal that they could not afford to let this resolution be adopted. So what they assured Dadabhai was, we request you to withdraw the resolution, but the substance of it, we will act on it. So they gave instructions to all the provinces to start collecting data on untouchables, who were otherwise at that time called depressed classes. And there was certain states where these measures were most evident. Directly ensuing from this 1916 debate that took place in the Imperial Legislative Council. In Madras in 1919, they set up an office. This was a first in India. Set up an office called Protector of Depressed Classes. Again, as a result of this consciousness that was introduced in the colonial rule about the need to ameliorate the lot of untouchables. And then Willingdon, who was governor of Madras, did an unprecedented thing, which is that he nominated a Dalit called M.C. Raja to the Madras legislature. For the first time ever, anywhere in the country, suddenly you have this untouchable called M.C. Raja sitting as an equal at this high table, that is the legislature of Madras presidency. A very huge presidency it was, and where other Indians, even upper caste Hindus, would therefore, as per the protocol of that institution, have to address him as honorable member. So this paved the way after the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms took place, when the reformed legislatures came into existence in 1921, when there was greater representation of Indians. The reforms they made, the rules that they formed under the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms required some of these provinces to nominate lower castes to these legislatures. That's how M.C. Raja was again nominated, and there came about some more legislators like Rettimalai Srinivasan or Veerayan. Now, against all odds, at that very early stage of awareness about untouchables, this man performed a miracle, this Veerayan. Again, somebody who's completely unknown, who never got his due. He pulled off a legislation. He did it through an amendment to some civic body legislations where he said that if these Dalits were not allowed to enter streets or enter markets, so people who deny them that right would be punished by way of being imposed a monetary penalty and so on. So that was a baby step, a very small measure, but it was the first ever legislation against untouchability. And it took place in Madras province at the instance of a Dalit legislator. And yet, in our history books, we don't know anything about it.
And that's part of the reason why in this whole conversation, we haven't talked a whole lot about Gandhi and Ambedkar, because those are the figures, the little that we know, those are the figures and their arguments that we know about. So in the interest of time, I'm going to fast forward the Congress from a time where it didn't want to deal with it, where it thought, this would cause a schism in the national movement they were trying to build in their big umbrella. They eventually take it on as an issue. And of course, there is the first, the Constitution, Ambedkar is being drafted, and untouchability, talking about it becomes part of it. But now going back to your original aim in writing this, Manoj, when you talk about looking at all these laws, until then you have the untouchability laws, and then eventually you have the more draconian law in 1989.
I wouldn't call it draconian.
Yeah, okay. A more supposedly stringent law in 1989.
Yeah.
But what has been the sort of footprint of the law? I mean, you start this because you realize so many Dalit massacres have been faced with so much impunity. So can we go back to the original claim that Gandhi used to make, saying that, look, you can't change all these things by laws. You have to change the hearts and minds of people.
It is instructive to see how for every small reform relating to untouchability, they had to fight. For instance, after this 1926 breakthrough made by Veerayan in Madras, the first enactment that Congress brought about was post-1935 law. There was a government formed under Rajaji, and they took up. For the first enactment, it's considered been passed by Congress in 1938. It's called Madras Removal of Civil Disabilities Act, 1938. Now, what does it do? It does not penalize any act of untouchability. All it says is that customs that are against untouchables, that validate discrimination against untouchables, will not be recognized by any court or authority. But it does not say what would happen if somebody still violates this law. Why it does not do so is not because Rajaji himself was practicing untouchability. It's simply a recognition of the fact that the prejudice was so deeply entrenched and so pervasive that these leaders who had this need in them, political or otherwise, to carry everybody with them, to do it all in a very small, incremental way. And then the following year, when the B.G. Kher government in Bombay attempts a similar legislation relating to allowing untouchables to access various public amenities, whether it's roads or in Bombay it was not so much the roads. Roads was a big issue in the south. In Bombay it was more about water bodies. So the question that Ambedkar, who was a member of the Bombay legislature, and his followers raised was, how is it that you are not treating it as a cognizable offense? Meaning, if somebody commits untouchability, if somebody denies Dalit access to a public amenity, why should the police not be empowered to register an FIR, investigate the case, and prosecute the offender? Why should it be treated as a non-cognizable offense, which meant that the onus was on the aggrieved untouchable, that if he feels offended and if he has resources, he could engage a lawyer, go to a magistrate and file a private complaint. So even then, B.G. Kher is on record saying in the legislature that this is undesirable. We can't make such leaps. This would be a bit too radical. Why? Because for centuries we have believed that it is part of my religious duty to keep them apart. So we can't overnight tell them, no, it's now an offense. Now, they come back to power. B.G. Kher comes back to power after the World War. And then in 1946, he again becomes Prime Minister of Bombay under that law. And he takes up the unfinished law, which he could not enact in 1939. He takes it up now. Now, he's more willing to do it because this was when the independence was round the corner. There was already that talk of freedom and so on. And in that changed environment, he was now more willing to treat it as a cognizable offense. But then that was also not enough. People like Ambedkar later went on to say, when it was taken up post-independence, that 1954 Untouchability Offences Act, again he came out with a blistering attack. He was saying, why so little, so late? Why are you imposing such small penalties? So now that you have recognized it as a cognizable offense, you are subverting the law, the cause, if not the law, because the law itself is now imposing a very small penalty. So he pointed out that this will only mean that in a very farcical way, somebody would be imposed a penalty of 1 rupee or 5 rupees and he would be let off. And that's exactly what happened. His warnings were not heeded. So this law that was finally enacted in 55, ignoring the concerns raised by Ambedkar, and finally during emergency, another irony, it was during emergency that this law was amended to say that, many of the concerns that Ambedkar raised were addressed. So all this goes to show how reluctant people were, our legislators, our leaders, our society was, to really match the rhetoric with measures, legal measures, with enough teeth to really serve as a deterrent. So when it was all being done with such reluctance, you can imagine that when this kind of large-scale atrocities, large-scale violence began to take place, there was so much reluctance on the part of different arms of the Indian state. So I may mention at this point that in the early years, just as there was a pushback by white supremacists in the US to the abolition of slavery, there was a pushback by caste supremacists in India. But it took a while. In 1957, there was some riots triggered by an election dispute. But it was only in 1968, on Christmas, India saw the first ever instance of mass violence targeting Dalits. This was well after, say, Gandhi's death, well after Ambedkar passed away, well after even Nehru passed away. So in their lifetime, these big leaders did not see anything of this nature, anything on this scale. The first instance was in a place called Kilvenmani in Tamil Nadu. And that became a prototype for this kind of violence and then for this kind of impunity. Because though some 42 women and children were burnt alive in Kilvenmani in one room, in circumstances that remained unexplained, why all of them were burnt, were found in one room. So many of them packed so tightly into one tiny room, 42 of them. Why is it that they could not escape? I mean, all those questions remain unexplained. And yet the Madras High Court, no less an authority than the Madras High Court, thought it fit to exonerate each and every one of the accused persons. So you had this instance of full-scale impunity for that. So that set the template for further instances in 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yeah, exactly. And you recount those state stories in Bihar and all of them, including one where actually finally justice is served. But finally, I wanted to just ask you, Manoj, what do you think, having gone through all this material, what is the future for caste equality and the ongoing battle going to look like now, especially now that we're moving towards this economically weaker section reservation, which is departing from the idea that backwardness in India is fundamentally related to caste, which is what all these measures and laws were trying to address?
Well, my book has 18 chapters dealing with 18 different themes. You would notice that this very obvious theme of reservations, what we call reservations or affirmative action, is not one of those 18 themes. I did intend to have it in this book, but then there was so much to cover in each of those chapters, and I realized that I needed to come up with another volume. So it's going to be figuring in my next volume. This and so many other issues, like for instance, intercaste marriage you talked about. I do deal with intercaste marriage, how it took somebody like, say, Vittal Bhai Patel to come up with that bill for the first time in 1918, and how he faced, again, pushback from the likes of Malviya and Banerjee, and how that led to a 30-year battle before finally in 1949, when Thakur Das Bhargava, a member of the Constituent Assembly, who was responsible for that enactment. Now, when he introduces it, at that stage, it was a different environment, as I told you in the context of that 46 law. Suddenly there was greater receptivity, there was greater awareness of the fact that we can't now oppose this anymore, because the excuse that was available all these years, these decades, that, anyway, there's this colonial ruler to blame, to scapegoat. When in fact, whenever these reforms were being attempted by the progressive section of Hindus, the opposition was from another section, the obscurantist, the conservative section, the orthodox section of Hindus. So that section was on the back foot around the time of independence, especially after Mahatma Gandhi's murder. So in 1949, they were anyway pushing back against the Hindu Code bill that was being attempted. So when it came to this very piecemeal legislation, very small step forward, which is recognizing intercaste marriage, they finally allowed it. So one of the topics I intend to take up is something which is happening in a large scale, especially in the South, which is that intercaste marriages leading to honor killings. And they're not necessarily between, say, traditional upper caste and Dalits. It could be between lower castes, it could be between OBCs, other backward castes, and Dalits. Even such marriages leading to, this kind of violence. So I intend to, one of my themes would be that. It's not a battle between lower caste and upper caste, but it was a battle between the liberals and conservatives, those who believed in the values of equality and fraternity, and those who were trying to perpetuate the system in the name of religion, in the name of customs, and so on.
Well, we're going to look forward to more chapters in the next volume when that comes out. But thank you so much for joining us today, Manoj Mitta.
It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Acclaimed journalist Manoj Mitta's latest book is Caste Pride, Battles for Equality in Hindu India. Send us your thoughts about this show wherever you get your podcast from. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcast. Thanks as always for listening. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.